you. I'm going to start by saying this is actually, I don't have any real conclusions. This is actually a part of to some extent, what I will present today is part of a failed project to some extent, because this was a part of my dissertation, a chapter that never actually was finished, but I'm going to present this failed material. And it failed for several reasons. I think it was a project in its own that never really could make it into. And I was addressing it from several different angles. The role of, the main interest in this was the role of photography in graffiti. It was primarily done between 2006 and 2010, so I worked with this a lot when I was applying for PhD. And this was actually one of the main arguments for me actually entering the PhD, but it ended up studying the zero tolerance, for example, on graffiti and other things. And also the role was here addressing also knowledge, in a sense that since graffiti is always, or not always, but almost always removed, sometimes within hours, sometimes within a week, the memory of what has been done is very dependent on photography. So photography is functioning as a museum, in a sense, in a graffiti context. And especially the books that have been produced functions as museums. And there is the books, especially the early books, what Malcolm talked about, is the books when the graffiti subculture itself had gained some kind of access to publishing. But the early books were actually done a lot by adult people, professional people, journalists, etc. And most of the graffiti writers at the time were young people who had no access to these distribution networks, etc. So what I was interested in this project was the role of photography in graffiti and, to some extent, street art, the production, collection, the distribution of photographic images. And what I'm interested here also is a little bit photo theoretical aspects to frame this material, because I framed it partly as cultural heritage. This is a cultural heritage practices to some extent. Framed it a little bit as in other types of art historical narratives, etc. And that's probably also why I never made it into the dissertation. But what I was also interested in was not the people actually doing graffiti so much, but the people documenting graffiti, because there are a bunch of people who are usually not actively into the graffiti subculture who do document graffiti. And I was interested in their role. In previous research, there had been a lot written about why graffiti writers do what they do. And I was more, when doing ethnographic research, I was more interested in people taking pictures of graffiti, why they do it and how they treat the image. So it's not about self-chronicling in the sense that Malcolm talked about, but rather people chronicling other people. So I did 11 interviews, in-depth interviews, from April 2008 to August, and I was primarily working in Stockholm, but some interviews were in Gothenburg, and also did a couple of interviews in New York. So I tried to get from my own local context and from within the graffiti subculture, the very idealized place. And I was to some extent interested in the social status of documenters, which is questioned to some extent in the graffiti subculture. I was asking questions about the self-identity, the primary use of the photographic pictures, driving forces, techniques of taking pictures, methods of acquiring photos, and strategies of collecting, selecting, and organizing this material, and technologies of visualization. So, I mean, it was about, a lot of graffiti research had been done in looking at practices of doing graffiti. And I was interested in practices of looking and materializing, looking at graffiti. And my first question to all my interviewees was in the form of a statement, because I selected them because they were famous in the graffiti subculture for having a lot of pictures on graffiti. And I had a statement that you have a collection of graffiti. Can you tell me about it? And then we had semi-structured interview. And all I contacted except one, I contacted 12 people. One rejected because he was a little bit stigmatized within his local community for being this photographic collector. So he didn't want to be interviewed. He didn't want to have more of that. And I have chosen in this case to actually anonymize the people, but several of them are fairly easily identifiable in the respective context. And one of them is actually a world-renowned photographer with urban culture as the main area of interest. And unlike the other interviewees, this photographer was already working as a photographer when she started taking pictures of graffiti. And also, her collection includes, unlike the other interviewees, only her own photographs. All the other ones are not photographers. They're collecting pictures of graffiti. Of course, in some cases, they are also photographers. And the usages were, to some extent, didactic. They wanted to learn and understand how one could compose graffiti. Accessibility, whoops, that was one. Accessibility, also that, for example, one of them was a wheelchair user, so he could not access a lot of the graffiti. And also, some of them were interested in distributing, to explain and provide a framework for the public to understand the graffiti subculture. And several of them, especially in hindsight, was interested in documentation, in preserving, and what they often refer to as an undervalued artistic expression. And I made 2 exhibitions, one at the Historical Museum in Stockholm and one at this contemporary art space. And here each interviewee told their own story in length. So we're between 40 minutes and an hour and 20 minutes when they talked about their images. So some themes arose from this material. For example, the relation between artistic and forensic evidence. Authentic spectatorship was one thing that came up, and memory. And this is the rest of the talk. I'm going to share some of the quotes and some of the themes that came up. And why, I would say also, is this relevant? Because actually a lot of graffiti, when it's done, is actually very difficult to actually see. This is the typical way of how you would actually see graffiti, I would say. Along the train line, it usually is kind of a blur. This is my way of trying to envision how you actually see graffiti. It's very difficult to study graffiti when you pass by the train. And I also tried to be visualizing the gaze of a subcultural participant taking the train, with your eye is actually trying to see the different pieces, and then it might look a little bit like this. Like you see some forms and here and there. But what it looks like in books and on photos, it's more like this. I mean, it's a stable picture. You objectify what is otherwise a quite fluid impression. And quite often it's also like this, that you go in closer and can actually take out parts of graffiti and put them in. So this is a part of this long wall done by Icaros. So, so viewing was one of the things that came up, which is quite natural in a sense. And also this kind of relationship between these people who take a lot of pictures and those who take pictures only of their own graffiti came up in the interview. For one person I interviewed, for example, said, those who photograph other people's painting art, they are really nerds in the way that you're like fans. You become a fan club to other painters since you photograph their stuff and not your own, right? But, and then he laughed, all the time we were doing this, it never struck me. I was just fascinated by the fact that if you really put an effort to it, you can get hold of some really fucking cool paintings to watch and get inspiration from. And he also talked about the book Danish Wellstyle Graffiti, which was important for him, and this is his collection of pictures.
När jag blev introducerad.
Another of the, I want to give you a few sound bites from the interviews also. This is a person that I bumped into a graffiti jam in New York. So this is the only person I didn't know before that he was actually a collector of pictures. But he had his own collection with him and showed to people, a little bit like Malcolm showed his. So he was walking around with his pictures. And he underpinned, he several times he said, I've seen all of the paintings that I have in my collection. The photos are only of pieces that I have seen. So his photo collection was actually also Xerox copies out of books, etc., that he put into his photo album because he had seen it. He pointed out this several times. And I saw this as a kind of authentic viewership. Let me see if you can hear what he has to say.
My family kind of disapprove it. Oh, it's not this and that. They complain. But then, years later, I said, I'm going to start a collection. But don't get me wrong. I saw the walls, the trains, everything. It's like a myth. Every picture tells a story.
Every picture tells a story. So he might be countering Susan Sontag's quote there to a certain extent. But I think he also it's also a social practice. Of course, he talks about the images. Another one I spoke to was discussing how he was collecting it. I divided the collection into different crews, and they all had different folders. And in the folder in each crew, I filed each individual unique painters in sections. Everyone was separated and very easy to find. So what he would have done with this painting, which is one painting in a sense, he would have put it in 12 different places in his collection because there are 12 different painters involved in the collection, in the painting. So, and that also gave me an idea that perhaps you should see a big graffiti piece as an exhibition rather than a painting in a sense. They are individual paintings in a sense. Another thing that came up was artistic versus forensic evidence, and this is actually part of the same quote, where he reflected upon them. It was he says, well, I guess it looked like the office of the Vandal Squad, the anti-graffiti police, with these folders. It would probably be a gold mine for the police to get a hold of, even if there were not that many live pictures, pictures of people doing graffiti. It was incredibly well compiled, so you could actually find different people. And another of my interviewees who ran a website on graffiti also pointed out that I don't want to have responsible having that kind of intelligence. I realized the more information I put in one place, the more of a target I made myself for the police. So I've always been very careful of what I collect because I'm aware that I could be raided by the police and my information seized. So far, knock on wood, no raids at my house. That's good, but I'm still very careful about keeping sensitive material at my house because it's a responsibility I've taken and it affects other people. I try to be very responsible about it. And one of my favorite ones to interview was actually a graffiti chronicler, but also graffiti remover as a profession. He was a buffer, so he was both the one taking pictures, but he was also the one removing graffiti. You would probably want to have this kind of ideas, some kind of psychoanalytic idea, but I think the simple thing for him, he was a working class dude enjoying graffiti. And how can you see a lot of graffiti? Well, you work as a graffiti remover. But what he actually made himself was in charge of the photo archive of the graffiti removal firm. So he was kind of tapping what was material that was supposed to go to the police and tapping that. Thank you. So he said we have graffiti removal in the entire subway system. We developed all the photos to make police report. From there, I found many paintings that I don't see myself. I could borrow the negatives and develop pictures to my own collection. So because this is an interesting, because within the graffiti subculture, you know that the first thing police look for if they raid a house, they look for photos as criminal evidence. But this was, instead of going from artistic evidence to forensic evidence, this was going from forensic evidence to artistic evidence into the, and he was also giving pictures to the graffiti community. One of the other was memory and history, and especially since pictures, as I said, photographic pictures was the main medium where graffiti history had been told. And one of them was this professional photographer who said that I don't want my all those pictures getting out. They aren't my best pictures. I feel that these are my rejects. There's somebody else's best pictures maybe. The person who's trained painting it is the best picture of their piece that had ever been taken. So this is a dilemma for her because she's a professional photographer and she has chosen some specific places. But so she makes a compromise. She sliced out the piece out of the background so you can get the actual painting but not the whole picture. So that's her compromise. Oh yeah. So that's an example of this. And memory was by several people taking up. This is the same as you heard earlier in format D, as I call him. And this is a little bit longer where he actually talks about how, so the idea, especially professionally distributed pictures have had a huge impact on who is remembered and who is not remembered within graffiti history. But he is an amateur, but also for him memory was very important. And one of the main questions I asked everyone was if they had like a favorite picture in the collection. Because also being an art historian, as Mike might not have mentioned, I'm interested in this kind of masterpiece idea, and if this was also within this context. So I asked him if he had a favorite picture, and he answered me again by evoking memory, the picture and what it represents as something that has been.
Oh man, I have a favorite. My favorite train that Risk he did with Say is with the Dig Dug, the video game from the 80s. I seen that train as a kid back in 1986, and I went out of my mind when I saw that train pulled in at 137th Street Station. Man, it was bad, man. And it's like a year to remember in 86. And you know, that was the changing times, you know. I missed the trains. But I'm very thankful that I saw graffiti on the subways in the 80s as a kid.
So again, I did this interview in 2008, I think, and he was reflecting on the graffiti train scene in New York in the 1980s, which was for him the golden age of graffiti and what his collection was mainly trying to capture. So that was kind of the last slide. I wanted to end with this one. So this is what I would say also, just this is a show of this material. I'm still interested in working with it somehow and making something out of it, but I don't know really how to actually find a way of framing it that would be productive in a research context. So it might be enough for this. Thank you.